The late morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the upscale nail salon, nestled in the heart of downtown Austin, casting golden streaks across marble floors and glass display counters lined with bottles of imported polish. Everything in the space, from the muted classical music playing in the background to the floral water served in delicate crystal glasses, whispered exclusivity and restraint. Into this curated serenity stepped Melody Gray, 26, her presence as quiet as the breeze slipping through the automatic doors behind her. She wore a pale cotton sundress, slightly wrinkled from the heat, and flat sandals that had clearly walked more miles than the average customer's designer heels. Her auburn hair was braided into a loose plait, and a wide-brimmed straw hat hung from her fingers. She didn't wear makeup, and there was a visible patch of sun-faded freckles across her nose and cheeks, like soft punctuation marks on a face that was both open and unguarded. The receptionist, barely glancing up from her monitor, greeted her with a sterile smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, her tone one shade short of polite. Melody responded with a soft nod and gave her name. After a short pause and a few loud keystrokes, the receptionist replied, "We have a last-minute slot for a basic file and polish. No time for enhancements or design, unfortunately. Will that be all right?" Melody nodded again, her voice quiet but warm. "Of course." As she stepped further into the salon, the energy in the room shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. A pair of older women, immaculately dressed and seated near the window with martini glasses and lacquered nails, turned their heads just slightly. One of them adjusted her scarf and leaned in to whisper something that made the other raise her eyebrows and glance quickly in Melody's direction. A young technician escorted her to a station in the far corner, away from the main floor and mirrors, next to a small storage trolley and a fake ficus tree that partially obscured the view. As Melody sat, the receptionist appeared again, this time with a paper mask in hand. "Would you mind putting this on?" she asked with a thin smile. "Some of our clients are filming today, and we try to maintain a certain aesthetic for the space." Melody accepted it without protest and tied it behind her ears, her expression unchanged, though her gaze lingered on the woman's perfectly manicured nails and the quiet disdain behind her carefully measured words. The gentle whir of nail drills and the soft murmur of ambient music filled the air, creating a surface-level calm that didn't quite mask the underlying tension. Melody sat motionless in the corner chair, her hands resting quietly on a neatly folded linen towel, while the young technician began preparing her station with mechanical efficiency. There was nothing rude in the way she moved, but there was also no warmth, no eye contact, no introductory smile, no small talk. Just the sterile rhythm of protocol. Acetone, cotton, buffer block. As Melody extended her fingers, the technician hesitated for the briefest of moments, her eyes flicking across the fine calluses and faint, pale scars that traced the back of Melody's knuckles, as though trying to decode a language she didn't recognize. Without a word, she dipped a cotton ball into solution and began scrubbing away the last of a long, faded clear coat, her touch brisk, detached. A pair of middle-aged women seated 2 tables away spoke just loud enough to carry. One wore oversized sunglasses despite being indoors, and the other had a perfectly symmetrical bob that framed a face taut with fillers. "She looks like one of those girls who bike to work," the one with the bob said, her voice syrupy and amused. "Probably a barista, or maybe she's into that van life thing." The other woman chuckled softly and sipped from her glass. "More likely an Etsy artist," she added. "See her hands? That's clay or wire work. My niece does crafts like that. Sweet girl, always broke." Melody heard them, of course, but she didn't turn or flinch. Her face remained unreadable, her eyes fixed somewhere just beyond the ficus plant's drooping plastic leaves. The technician, emboldened perhaps by the growing mood in the room, finally spoke. "You want me to keep them short, right?" she asked abruptly. "Too long doesn't suit natural types." The comment wasn't exactly rude, but it wasn't kind either, and it lingered uncomfortably in the space between them. Melody smiled politely, her voice calm. "Just neat, thank you." The technician made a small sound of acknowledgement and resumed working, filing quickly, her strokes sharp and impatient. At that moment, the receptionist reappeared, leaning slightly into Melody's periphery. "Would you be all right relocating to Station 6? She asked, her tone light but insistent. "We have a walk-in and need to open up this space. It'll just be a few steps over, same service, same technician. Melody looked at the new seat. It was positioned awkwardly near the back hallway, close to the employee restroom, and nearly out of view of the salon's central mirror wall. Still, she nodded and rose without complaint, gathering her small straw toad and moving silently. As she passed the center of the room, she caught the eye of a woman sitting under a sleek, chrome drying lamp. A woman older than the others with silver hair pulled into an elegant bun, and a deep green silk scarf draped over her shoulders. Their eyes met only briefly, but in that moment, something like recognition flickered across the older woman's face. Curiosity, perhaps, or discomfort at what she was witnessing. Melody inclined her head slightly, a gesture of quiet grace, and moved on. The technician resumed work in the new seat, noticeably less careful now, her attention scattered, her filing growing more careless. "Sorry," she muttered as she accidentally nicked the skin near Melody's thumb. A tiny bead of blood surfaced, and she dabbed it quickly without apology or pause. From the other side of the salon, one of the middle-aged women called out to the receptionist, "Could we get more lemon in the water? Mine's bland." The receptionist nodded, then turned to Melody with a perfunctory smile. "Are you comfortable back there? We don't usually seat guests in that section, but you seemed very easygoing." Before Melody could answer, a familiar laugh echoed through the salon. One of the gossiping women had found something in her phone and turned it toward her friend. "Look at this. Can you believe how people dress these days? No shame. Honestly, if you don't have the face for it, just cover up. Do us all a favor." The other woman laughed, and the receptionist forced a thin smile. "Ladies, please," she said weakly, but there was no real reprimand in her voice. Melody's technician shook her head subtly and murmured, "Some people forget they're not at home." But the jab wasn't aimed at the gossipers, it was aimed at Melody, and everyone knew it. The aesthetic of the salon, once serene and indulgent, had curdled into something sharper, more performative. This was not simply beauty as self-care, it was beauty as hierarchy, as currency. And in this hierarchy, Melody had been quietly, collectively assigned her place, at the edge of the frame, muted and managed. She said nothing. She sat with her spine straight, her breath steady, her fingers resting on the towel. Small, strong hands that had held tools heavier than nail files, shaped structures taller than this building, drawn lines that would one day become walls, courtyards, schools, libraries. But in this moment, no one knew, and no one cared to ask. The technician moved faster now, her file working over Melody's nails in short, impatient strokes that left the edges rough, uneven. She didn't seem to notice, or perhaps she did and simply didn't care. Melody remained still, her hands soft in the technician's grip, offering no resistance, no irritation, but her silence, her composure, her very lack of reaction seemed to irritate the girl more than if she'd protested outright. "You don't talk much, do you?" she said, not looking up. "We get all kinds in here. College girls, influencers, lawyers, even a senator's wife came last week. People talk. They tell you things, but you're quiet. You must be a teacher, or a yoga person, maybe?" Melody's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Something like that," she said gently, not elaborating. The technician let out a soft snort and switched tools. She applied the base coat with unnecessary force, tugging at the skin around Melody's nails. At the front of the salon, a new group of women had arrived, younger this time, mid-30s, expensive athleisure, big handbags, sunglasses perched on their heads like tiaras. They took in the room with easy ownership, laughing among themselves, and were immediately offered drinks, warm towels, and the best seats. One of them, a platinum blonde with an oversized engagement ring and a sharp voice, glanced toward the back. "Oh no, is that the only free tech?" she asked, pointing in Melody's direction. "I don't want someone who's distracted." The receptionist quickly assured her another technician would be available soon. Melody, still seated, became aware of the eyes drifting toward her. She wasn't doing anything, just sitting there. But somehow her presence was inconvenient, her face too bare, her demeanor too subdued, her very existence quietly disruptive to the curated environment of soft luxury and shallow harmony. The technician excused herself abruptly to get a top coat, leaving Melody alone. She placed her hands on her lap and looked out toward the front desk. watching as the receptionist leaned close to one of the new clients and whispered something that made the woman chuckle behind her hand. At that moment, the older woman with the green scarf, the same one who had noticed Melody earlier, rose from her seat and walked slowly across the salon, cane tapping gently on the floor. She paused near the refreshment stand, poured herself a small cup of lemon water, and then, with deliberate grace, turned toward Melody's corner. For a second, their eyes met again. The older woman opened her mouth as if to speak, but just then, the technician returned and sat down quickly, glancing nervously at the exchange. The older woman hesitated, then returned to her seat without saying a word. The moment passed, but something had shifted. The technician resumed her work, now more cautious, more aware of how visible her actions had become. Yet the mood in the room had turned. The gossip had stopped being casual and had become a spectacle, subtle but sharpened, a quiet theater of looks, smirks, coded phrases. A woman at the front, flipping through a fashion magazine, suddenly held up a page to her friend. "Now that," she said loudly, "is what someone should look like when they sit in a place like this. Not some granola girl from a co-op." Her friend gave a theatrical laugh, and the receptionist, failing to conceal her amusement, pretended to tidy the desk. Melody caught sight of her own reflection in the window glass. It was a faint, soft outline, a silhouette of someone who did not belong, not by their rules. She looked down again at her hands. The polish had pooled unevenly near the cuticles. One nail was already smudged. She didn't say anything. The technician muttered, "Sorry," but didn't offer to fix it. "I think we're done," she said, glancing at the clock. Melody nodded. "Thank you." She rose and made her way toward the front, her sandals whispering against the floor. As she approached the reception desk, the blonde woman with the engagement ring shifted slightly to block her path, under the pretense of reaching for her phone. "Oops, sorry," she said flatly, not moving. Melody stepped aside without comment. When she reached the counter, the receptionist printed out a receipt and placed it on a clipboard, pointing to the total with a capped pen. "That'll be $48 even. Cash or card?" Melody reached into her bag and produced an old leather wallet, its edges worn soft from years of use. She handed over her card. As the payment processed, the receptionist glanced up at her and offered a smile just wide enough to be called polite. "You know," she said, "you might consider a consultation before your next visit. Our senior stylist can help you find a look that fits this space a little better. Something more polished." Melody didn't respond. She signed her name and took the receipt. As she turned to leave, one of the younger women called after her, fake sweetness dripping from her voice. "You forgot your mask, honey. Don't want to shock the pedestrians." There was a ripple of laughter, not loud, just enough to sting. Melody paused, turned slightly, and looked at the mask left on the armrest of her chair. She walked back, picked it up, folded it neatly, and placed it in the small bin by the door marked "Used Items." Then she stood still for one breath. Two. Just long enough for the room to grow uncomfortably quiet. Then she walked out, never once looking back. The door hissed closed behind her. The laughter stopped. And for the first time that morning, no one spoke. The sun outside had grown brighter, climbing higher into the cloudless Texas sky, casting long, defined shadows along the sidewalk as Melody stepped out into the open air. The door of the salon clicked shut behind her, a faint metallic sound, final and indifferent. She blinked against the light, adjusted the strap of her straw tote over her shoulder, and exhaled. Slowly, not in frustration, but in something closer to weariness, the kind that settles into the bones quietly and without permission. The hum of the city moved around her. Distant traffic, the rhythmic patter of a cyclist passing, the indistinct murmur of conversation from a cafe down the street. She didn't look back at the salon. There was no need. What she had expected going in, a simple hour of care, a moment of stillness, had been displaced by something else. A reminder of the quiet ways people assign value, the way presentation could become a weapon, wielded as softly as a smile, as gently as a joke spoken just loudly enough to be heard. She walked slowly down the street past a florist setting out buckets of fresh peonies, past a man with a cello case waiting at a bus stop, past a mother kneeling to tie her son's shoe. The city, in all its mundane beauty, went on. Across from the salon stood an old brick building, modernized with sleek glass panels and an LED billboard mounted above the entrance. A space that had, for decades, been a theater and now served as a cultural center. It was here that Melody paused, standing on the curb beneath the pale blue sky, her reflection faint in the dark glass of the building's facade. Then, slowly, the billboard above her flickered to life. It had been dormant all morning, its black screen blending with the architecture unnoticed. Now it glowed softly, warming into color, a calm, earthy palette of ochre and green. And then, unmistakably, her face appeared, not posed, not glamorized. A photograph of her taken months ago by a colleague, her brow furrowed in thought as she studied blueprints with a pencil tucked behind her ear, wearing the same woven braid, the same freckled skin. Across the image, the text appeared in quiet serif font. Melody Gray, Urban Architect, Human Spaces Initiative. Keynote speaker, Designing for Dignity. Tonight at 7 p.m. Below it, smaller. City Auditorium, Public Welcome. She didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She stood still, her hands at her sides, her shadow long and narrow behind her. People passed by. A teenager with headphones, a couple with iced coffees, a jogger wiping sweat from his brow. And some of them looked up at the screen, then at her, and then back again. Recognition dawned in some faces, in others curiosity. But she didn't seek it. She simply existed in that moment, with no defense, no shield of performance, no need to explain who she was or why she had walked into that salon. A few steps behind her, inside the salon's wide front windows, a woman stood frozen, her manicured hand gripping a bottle of cuticle oil. One of the stylists had glanced up, caught sight of the billboard, and nudged her friend, who gasped audibly. The older woman in the green scarf sat straighter in her chair, turned fully to the window, and then looked not at the billboard, but at Melody. Their eyes met for the third time that day. This time, the older woman gave the slightest nod, a gesture that seemed to say not just, "I see you," but "I understand." And for Melody, that was enough. She turned and crossed the street, her pace unhurried, her back straight, walking not toward the past, but toward the stage that waited for her just beyond the tinted doors of the auditorium, where words like function and form gave way to safety, memory, and belonging. She wasn't in a rush. The work was already done. The structures had already been built. What came next wasn't about proving her worth. It was about reminding people what dignity looked like when it wore plain clothes and said very little, yet changed everything. Inside the salon, the mood had shifted, though no one acknowledged it aloud. The women who had laughed behind Melody's back now sat uncomfortably in their chairs, their attention drawn again and again to the window where the billboard continued its slow rotation, illuminating the street below with the soft, natural hues of Melody's portrait. No music played now. Someone had forgotten to restart the playlist after a pause. And in the silence, the absence of melody, of distraction, was deafening. The receptionist stood awkwardly at the front desk, her fingers hovering uncertainly over the keyboard, pretending to check appointments that didn't exist. Her polished demeanor had cracked, just slightly, enough to show that the confident detachment was always a mask, and it no longer fit properly. One of the younger clients, still cradling a half-finished glass of cucumber water, leaned toward her technician and whispered something with forced casualness. But her voice carried farther than she meant it to. "I think I saw her in a magazine. She's not just an architect, she's the one who did that project for the women's shelter near the riverfront." The technician paused mid-stroke, then nodded slowly. "My cousin lives in that complex," she murmured. "They have gardens on the roof and a daycare in the lobby. They say it's the first time they've felt like they had a real home." There was no sarcasm in her voice, only quiet wonder. The woman with the green scarf remained motionless, her hands resting lightly on her knees, her gaze never leaving the window. It was clear now that she knew exactly who Melody was. Perhaps not by name until today, but by the work, the values, the legacy that had touched her life in some distant way. She turned toward the platinum blonde seated closest to her, the one who had made the snide comment earlier about granola girls, and said calmly, "Some people build spaces. Others just fill them with noise. The woman blinked, startled by the quiet sharpness of the remark, and looked away. Meanwhile, a commotion had begun near the front as two women stepped into the salon from the street. One of them wore a lanyard with a press badge. The other carried a stack of programs and folders. They spoke briefly with the receptionist, who stiffened at the sight of the logo on their materials. It matched the one now glowing behind Melody's face on the billboard. The women explained in low tones that they were preparing for the evening event across the street and needed to confirm the guest of honor's scheduled arrival time for media coordination. "She was here," the receptionist stammered, her voice higher than usual. "She didn't say anything. We didn't know." The woman with the badge gave a polite but pointed smile. "We understand," she said. "Ms. Gray is known for her modesty. She often doesn't announce herself. But thank you for your time." As the two women turned to leave, one of the technicians, the same who had tended to Melody earlier, stood abruptly, wiping her hands on her apron. "Excuse me," she said, her voice louder than intended. The room fell silent. "I didn't know who she was. I didn't treat her well. If she comes back, could you tell her I'd like to apologize?" The two women paused, exchanging a glance, then nodded gently. "We'll let her know." As they left, the air in the salon grew heavier, not with guilt alone, but with something deeper. The dawning realization that they had witnessed something significant, and their roles in it had not been flattering. The platinum blonde lowered her voice. "It's not like we were cruel. I mean, we didn't know." But the words hung limp in the air, insufficient, unconvincing. From the back of the salon, the older woman in the green scarf stood up, collected her handbag, and made her way slowly to the exit. As she passed the receptionist, she paused and said, in a voice as soft as it was unyielding, "You don't need to recognize someone to respect them." Then she opened the door and stepped into the sunlight. Across the street, the LED billboard began a new sequence. Not Melody's face now, but images from her past projects. A housing complex with light-filled communal kitchens, a shelter for runaway teens with mosaic murals made by the residents. Themselves, a reading nook beneath an overpass transformed into a mobile library. There were no words, just places. Real places. Built with care. Seen now by people who had missed them before. In the salon, no one spoke. The silence wasn't hostile, and it was sobering. A technician glanced up, caught her own reflection in the mirror, and looked away quickly as if ashamed. Another began wiping down her station with an unusual thoroughness. Outside, the city continued. Melody, somewhere out there in the growing rhythm of the afternoon, was preparing for her speech, unaware of the awakening she had left behind, or perhaps knowing all along that respect, like beauty, doesn't shout. It shows up, quietly, on time, and leaves the world different than it found it. Evening settled over the city like silk, softening its edges and casting a golden hue over the facades of buildings, the sidewalks shimmering faintly from the day's heat. Outside the city auditorium, people began to gather in a slow but steady stream, their voices mingling with the sound of rustling programs and shuffling feet. There was no red carpet, no grand announcement, just a humble sign above the door that read, "Designing for Dignity, a public talk by Melody Gray." Inside, the main hall was spare but elegant, filled with rows of simple wooden chairs arranged in perfect symmetry, sunlight filtering through tall windows just beginning to dim into twilight. On the modest stage stood a single podium, flanked by two standing lamps and a low table with a pitcher of water. The screen behind it was blank. The audience was a cross-section of the city. Students in worn jackets with notebooks in hand, elderly couples leaning on each other's arms, mothers with curious teenage daughters, men in work boots and button-downs, women with lanyards and clipboards, and even, tucked quietly into a row near the back, two familiar faces from earlier that day. The technician from the salon sat beside the woman in the green scarf, their posture attentive, eyes forward. As the room filled and the lights dimmed, a hush settled like a held breath. Melody stepped onto the stage without fanfare. She wore the same pale cotton dress as that morning, the same woven braid down her back, but now her presence seemed to carry the weight of clarity, as if the day had distilled something essential in her. She stood at the podium, hands resting on either side, and for a moment she simply looked at the crowd. Then, quietly but without hesitation, she spoke. I've spent most of my adult life trying to make invisible people feel visible, she said. Her voice was even, resonant, without dramatics. Not by pointing at them, not by putting their names on plaques, but by shaping the spaces they move through so that they feel safe, welcomed, expected. So that dignity is not something they have to earn with a clean shirt or the right accent. So that it's simply there, built in, like a foundation. The room listened, motionless. This morning, she continued, I walked into a place that promised beauty, but only to the already beautiful. I was reminded with a smile and a scented towel that we are still so easily sorted, still so quick to assume who belongs and who doesn't, based on a haircut, a sandal strap, the curve of a freckle. There was no bitterness in her voice, only a profound steadiness. But the truth is, design doesn't start with lines on a page. It starts with questions. Who will sit here? Who will rest here? Who will be brave enough to walk through this door? Behind her, the screen lit up with quiet images. A hallway lined with hand-painted tiles, a rooftop garden with wheelchairs arranged in the sun, a doorway wide enough for a woman to carry both, groceries and a child at the same time. Melody paused. Dignity is not a luxury, she said, her gaze sweeping the room. It is not a feature, it is a right. And tonight I ask each of you, not to admire these buildings, but to carry that idea with you into the next room you enter, the next stranger you meet. For a long second, there was only silence. Then, as if released from a spell, the room rose into a quiet, genuine standing ovation. There were no whoops, no loud cheers, just applause, steady and full of something heavier than admiration. Respect, the kind that cannot be demanded, only earned, the kind that does not care about polish but about presence. Melody nodded once in acknowledgement, then stepped back from the podium and disappeared into the side wing, her figure framed briefly by the golden stage light before fading into the quiet. The next morning arrived quietly, the city bathed in pale light as if recovering from something sacred. The rhythm of daily life resumed. Trucks unloading produce at the corner market, a child chasing pigeons across the square, coffee shops flicking on their neon open signs one by one. On the same street where the nail salon stood, little had visibly changed. The glass windows were polished, the orchid arrangements refreshed, the playlist once again playing its curated blend of soft jazz and ambient warmth. Yet, for those who had been there the day before, something beneath the surface now felt altered, like a picture frame ever so slightly tilted. A small white sign had been taped to the glass of the salon's entrance, its lettering handwritten in fine calligraphy. We are closed for staff development. Today we reflect, we learn, we grow. No explanations, no apologies. Just the sentence, hanging quietly in the morning light like a held breath. Across the street, the billboard had returned to its rotation, but Melody's face appeared only once every few minutes now, alternating with images of upcoming city events. Still, when it came, people paused. A man waiting for a rideshare looked up and smiled faintly. A woman pushing a stroller slowed her steps. Inside the salon, behind the locked door, the receptionist sat with a notebook open in her lap, pen unmoving, while the technician who had served Melody the day before stared out the window, eyes unfocused, hands folded in her lap. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. A few blocks away in a small independent bookstore, Melody browsed the shelves unnoticed, dressed in the same quiet way she always was. She carried no air of importance, no glow of triumph, only a calm attentiveness that seemed to listen, even to the silence between the pages. At the register, a girl not much older than 20 leaned forward timidly and said, "I saw you speak last night. My grandmother came with me. She said you reminded her of someone she used to be." Melody smiled softly and replied, "That means more than you know." She stepped back into the street, sunlight falling across her face, and for a moment everything slowed. The sound of footsteps, the shuffle of leaves, the hum of the city. She walked on, unhurried and whole, leaving behind no spectacle, no grand statement, only the quiet echo of a truth now impossible to ignore. That the measure of a person is not found in how they are seen, but in how they make others feel when no one is watching.